Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rob Reish. I am an associate director here at the Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, the new space that we're sitting in. And I'm also the faculty director of the Center for Ethics and Society at Stanford. HAI and Ethics and Society are the co-hosts of this year's Tanner Lecture on AI and Human Values. The Tanner Lectures are one of the most distinguished lectures for philosophers, and we're really honored to have a chance to host a special Tanner Lecture that focuses on the intersection between AI and philosophy, or AI and human values. I'm really pleased now to introduce the president of Stanford University, Mark Tessier-Levine, who will introduce to you the event and our lecturer.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob, and good evening to all of you. It's wonderful to be here with all of you in person. And I'm so delighted to have the privilege to welcome you to this special Tanner Lecture on AI and human values. And I want to extend a special welcome both to those of you who are in person and also those of you who are following virtually. The Tanner Lectures, as I expect you all know, really seek to contribute to a better understanding of human behavior and human values through the latest scholarship and scientific learning. The lecture series was established 45 years ago by Obert Clark Tanner, a scholar, industrialist, and philanthropist. And today, 9 institutions across the US and the United Kingdom host the Tanner Lectures. But for Stanford, this is a special honor because of the very special bond that we share with Obert Tanner. He studied philosophy and earned his master's degree here in the 1930s. He became a member of our faculty, teaching religious studies from 1939 to 1944, and he also served as acting chaplain at the time. He then returned to the University of Utah in his home state, where he taught for nearly 30 years more after that. But throughout the decades, he maintained his connection with Stanford. In 1960, Obert and his wife Grace dedicated the Tanner Memorial Library of Philosophy as a memorial to 3 sons who had died young, tragically. Some of you will also be familiar with the Tanner Fountain, located in the circle between Memod and the Hoover Tower. The fountain was also a gift from the Tanners and a very favorite site for fountain hopping among our undergraduates. Of course, this lecture series is perhaps Obert's greatest contribution to human understanding. Obert and Grace saw these lectures as opportunities for scholars to contribute to the intellectual and moral life of the university and of humanity. Appointment as a Tanner lecturer recognizes uncommon achievement and outstanding abilities in the field of human values. So we're very honored that Professor Seth Lazar joins us today to deliver this year's lectures focused on algorithmic governance and political philosophy. Professor Lazar is the Professor of Philosophy at the Australian National University, an Australian Research Council Future Fellow, and a Distinguished Research Fellow of the University of Oxford Institute for Ethics and AI. Professor Lazar leads the Machine Intelligence and Normative Theory Lab at the ANU, where he's responsible for a team of scholars and students studying the morality and politics of data and artificial intelligence. In his work, Professor Lazar evaluates how big data, AI, and related technologies create new modalities of power and asks whether and how these new power relations can be legitimated and justified. He considers how we should design those systems both to account for human values and to mitigate for human biases. In addition to his work in artificial intelligence, Professor Lazar has studied the ethics of war, self-defense, and risk. He's the author of Sparing Civilians, a philosophical defense of the principle of civilian immunity in war. Professor Lazar's work has appeared in many top journals, including Ethics, Philosophy and Public Affairs, the Australasian Journal of Philosophy, and more. He's on the editorial board of Oxford Studies in Political Philosophy, as well as the executive committee for the Association for Computing Machinery Conference on Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency. He's one of the authors of a study by the US National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, which reported to Congress on the ethics and governance of responsible computing research. So as you can see, we really have the perfect lecturer for this series this week. Professor Lazar received his PhD in political theory from Oxford University in 2009. His talk this evening is titled Governing the Algorithmic City. It will focus on the ways in which we're increasingly connected to one another through algorithms and the power relations that result from those connections. He'll explore whether and how such power can be exercised permissibly and how those relations have the potential to reshape our society. Following Professor Lazar's lecture, we'll hear a response from Marion Fourcade, professor of sociology at UC Berkeley. Professor Fourcade received her PhD from Harvard University. She taught at NYU and Princeton University before joining the Berkeley Sociology Department in 2003. A comparative sociologist by training, she's interested in variations in economic and political knowledge and practice across nations. She's written about new forms of social stratification and morality in the digital economy, as well as about algorithmic societies. Professor Fourcade is the author of Economists and Societies, which explores the distinctive character of the discipline and profession of economics in 3 countries. She's also an associate fellow of the Max Planck Sciences Po Center on Coping with Instability in Market Societies and an external scientific member of the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies. After her remarks, she will join Professor Lazar in conversation, and together they will take some questions from the audience. Now, tomorrow, because as you all know, this is a series, tomorrow Professor Lazar will offer a second lecture on communicative justice and the distribution of attention. Arvind Narayanan, professor of computer science at Princeton University, will give the response. Then, on Thursday, we will conclude with a discussion seminar elaborating on the themes from this week's lectures. Josh Cohen, faculty at Apple University and distinguished senior fellow at the University of California, Berkeley, and Renee Jorgensen, assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Michigan, will join Professor Lazar for the seminar. Both tomorrow's lecture and the discussion seminar will be here in Gates in this building, and Wednesday's lecture will also be live streamed, and I encourage you all to join us for those events as well. And before I close and hand it over to Professor Lazar, I want to acknowledge the lecture's co-hosts, the McCoy Family Center for Ethics and Society and the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. Thank you for making this exchange of ideas possible. Thank you also to Professor Lazar and to the accomplished scholars who will be in conversation with him over the next 3 days. And with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Lazar.
All right. Okay, so I like to give computer scientists the cultural experience of a talk without slides. There is a handout, though, so don't worry. So if you look at the QR code, you'll be able to find the handout for the talk. I couldn't print up enough because it's not very sustainable to print so many for such a big group. But if you go there, you'll find it. The handout in philosophy is essentially it's a prospectus. It's a guide rope, and it's a set of receipts. So you can flick through and see what's coming. You can follow along if something I'm saying doesn't seem clear to you. And then at the end in the Q&A, you can sort of pinpoint your devastating objection precisely to the place where it needs to be targeted. Okay, so let me just start by thanking President Mark Tessier-Levine for that wonderful introduction. And the folks at HAI and the McCoy Center for Ethics and Society, Rob, my distinguished respondents, this is an incredible honor. I've been looking forward to this moment with equal sort of fear and anticipation for about a year and a half. I'm so excited to be here and to be doing it. And I've been saying to people that in a couple of days' time, I expect that I'm going to sort of grow 2 inches in height from the weight that's being lifted off my shoulders from getting through this. So I want to start by just sort of raising the question of what philosophy should contribute to our understanding of AI and human values. What should we expect from us? Because, you know, we've got this long tradition of thinking about human values. You might think that that means that we have a kind of monopoly on the subject. So obviously, of course, you know, AI and human values, that's our home turf, right? But there has been a fair amount of work recently by philosophers thinking about AI that has strained moral, political, and philosophical credulity in the sort of pursuit of promising what I think of as venture capital philanthropy, 10 to the 48 return on their moral investment. And this means that we actually have to defend our place in this debate. I think it's important not just to take it for granted. We should think about what we're really trying to do and what we can add. And I think that what we do best when we're doing philosophy about these topics, what I call normative philosophy of computing, is not to tell people what to do, but sort of help them understand better the challenges that they face, not kind of decide and allocate vast amounts of resources unilaterally, but help democratic publics understand the moral problems that face them. So figure out, like, if something feels intuitively wrong, the use of some new technology, like, why is that? What are the reasons that underpin it? Should we trust our instinct? Should we trust our gut? Help us figure out whether something is really new, and I know we're going to have a lot of discussion about that among the philosophers. Whether there are principles that we can already provide that we've already established that are relevant to this new domain, and help us articulate positive ideals to aim at, things that can actually provide us something to sort of unify around as we collectively together pursue social change. And I think we do this best when we do it in a way that is empirically and technically grounded. So this means if we're talking about AI, then understanding to some degree the underlying technology. I think it's important, though, not to over fetishize the mathematical and engineering aspects of this. To understand a technology is not only to know how to manipulate its internal components, it's to understand how it is used in society, the sort of impacts it has when it's used, its predictable failure modes. So I think that what we should be doing as people working on the normative philosophy of computing is taking these inputs from these other fields, from computer science, yes, but also law, STS, media studies, communication studies, sociology. And we should be outputting work that is legible to and useful to those disciplines, that provides a sense of sort of a greater depth maybe to the normative critique and an articulation of the positive ideals that we're trying to aim at. So that's what I've tried to do. And it's just such a wonderful privilege, not only to speak to all of you, but to have such brilliant scholars from sociology and computer science and philosophy engaging with my work over the next few days. That's the aspiration of the overarching project. So I should start. Okay. So my little corner of normative philosophy of computing, at least for these talks, is focused around political philosophy. Ultimately, the task of political philosophy is to help us figure out how to live together. It's about sort of normatively evaluating our social relations. And a good starting point, if you want to normatively evaluate something, is probably to understand them. Right? You want to know the thing that you're evaluating in order to be able to tell whether you're evaluating it correctly. But unfortunately, political philosophy is kind of slow to update. Like, its model of the social relations that obtain between us hasn't really been revised very significantly over the years, from whether it be John Rawls or all the way back to sort of Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Plato. We're still working with very similar understanding of what our social relations are and what the task of political philosophy is. In particular, we haven't updated it to accommodate the ways in which information technologies and computing have changed society. So at the very broadest level, the overarching ambition of this project, these lectures, and the broader book that it's part of, is to figure out how political philosophy can be updated to take these things into account, especially in the age of AI. So what I'm going to try and do in this lecture in particular is make a start on that project. First, I'm going to develop analytical tools which are distilled from the empirical literature that I've been reading, which will help me to characterize the key element of the ways our social relations have been changed by computing, and sort of pinpoint the specific thing that I think is going to be especially interesting for political philosophy to engage with. It's only one thing among many possibilities, but it's the one that I think is most significant. And this is the rise of algorithmically mediated social relations. That's the algorithmic city that I'm talking about. Very, very clear, not smart cities. I mean, it's just as a metaphor for the network of algorithmically mediated social relations. So I'm going to characterize that. I'm going to characterize the algorithmic intermediaries that constitute the algorithmic city. And then I'm going to show how they introduce new and intensified power relations. And I'm going to illuminate both the nature and the justification of that power. And I'll tell you a bit about why I think political philosophers should attend to the justification of power relations then. And then the last thing I'm going to do in the talk is to show how thinking about these, trying to think about how this type of algorithmic governance can be justified, will lead to and demand first-order advances in political philosophy. That's going to be a bit of a tasting menu. So the essay that this is drawn on is huge, and If you want to look at it, if you want to read it, scroll down to the bottom of the handout and you'll find a link to it there. I also want to say that one of the things about doing interdisciplinary research or doing philosophy that is based on interdisciplinary reading is that you have this sort of magpie thing going on where you find a brilliant thing in some other discipline, and then you do snowball sampling, you follow its references, and you find the things that it refers to. And it's really easy to miss stuff. So there are going to be areas that I talk about in the 2 lectures today and tomorrow where some of you are going to be way more experts in that particular area than I am as a philosopher. And I welcome suggestions for readings and things that I might have missed, things that might enhance my understanding of these questions. I think it's a really important part of doing this kind of research that you're kind of open to and able to kind of talk about the gaps in other people's kind of readings from other fields without that being causing defensiveness and what have you. So let me start. Right, so the algorithmic city. Okay, why introduce a new metaphor here? We have a bunch of them: cyberspace, network society. There's some good ones, there's some bad ones. I talk about sort of metaphors in the paper. As an analytic philosopher, the role of the metaphor here is literally just to give me a way of describing the longer thing that I want to say in fewer words. I don't want to I'm not buying into a broader set of implications of this notion of the algorithmic city. I mean very specifically the network of social relations that is mediated by algorithmic intermediaries. Okay, and I'm going to explain what all of those terms mean now. So social relations, those are stable patterns of communication and interaction. So, intimate social relations like those with your family and friends, or sort of less intimate ones like with your fellow co-workers, with co-citizens. Even the sort of shared participation in a common discourse is a kind of social relation. Obviously, they're more interesting and important the deeper, the more rich and persistent they are. Intermediaries are go-betweens. I always think of Iago when I write about this. And lately a little bit Missandei from Game of Thrones too. Intermediaries are people who communicate, or they communicate information or action from one party to another. They can be individuals, they can be institutions like a stock exchange. They can be, realtors, brokers, and they can be computational systems, as I'm going to be talking about. Because I'm interested in algorithmic intermediaries, and so what do I mean by algorithmic? Okay, so this is the most the least usefully defined word, I think, in this whole field, like a formal set of step-by-step instructions to go from an input to an output. That's a formal definition of an algorithm. So here I get to draw on my undergraduate degree in English literature and say that I'm using it in 2 ways. One is synecdoche and one is metonym. I really like the distinction between these 2 figures of speech. So synecdoche is when you mention a part of the whole. You refer to the whole by referring to the part. And algorithmic intermediaries, I focus on the algorithmic part, but it is part of a whole. So algorithmic systems are computational systems that involve lots of different software and hardware, besides just the pointy end, what I think of as the tip of the spear. And that goes back to not only sort of computational aspects, but also human labor, resources, the kinds of things discussed at length in Kate Crawford's book, Atlas of AI. So it's synecdoche, it's part of a whole, it's the tip of the spear, but it's also metonym. Metonym is when the part kind of stands for the whole, it represents the whole. It's the kind of the interesting bit. And the algorithmic part of algorithmic intermediaries is interesting because that's the part of these computational systems that I describe as being agential, just in a sort of functionally agential sense, in the sense that it represents its environment, it operates on the basis of that representation and the basis of a set of goals to realize an outcome. So it can kind of dynamically update depending on what the set of circumstances are in order to achieve a goal given its conditions. That's going to prove to be a really important part of why algorithmic intermediaries are interesting. So that's why it's important to call them that, rather than refer to sort of technological intermediaries or sociotechnical intermediaries, even though it's also true that everything I'm talking about could be described in that way. Now, this is a set of lectures on AI and human values, but I don't want to kind of reify or fetishize just the particular type of algorithm, whether it be kind of machine learning of a particular kind. Many of the moral issues that are raised by these systems are consistent across different types of kind of computational implementation. So I'm talking about AI, but I'm also talking about talking about blockchain, I'm talking about search, I'm talking about hash matching, like you find in some forms of automated content moderation, and copyright protection. So the basic empirical thesis of the paper is that many of our social relations are now partly or wholly constituted by algorithmic intermediaries. This includes all of the things you would immediately think of. So social media, for example, messaging. These days now, I think generative AI is going to be a really significant, it's going to be a really significant role for generative AI. One of the ways in which it's going to be used is to connect people by persuading them. Marketing and propaganda are going to be the two primary use cases for a lot of these tools. The idea of generative AI as a universal interface to information is going to lead to it being a kind of universal intermediary. But not only that, also e-commerce, two-sided markets are kind of paradigmatic examples of this. So, Amazon, eBay, Uber, two-sided failed market here in Stanford where it takes 15 minutes to get an Uber at any time. I don't know why that is. Search is really important, like your intermediary to the information that is generated in the world. App stores, security, Cloudflare. I don't know if it's just me, but maybe like something about my computer always means that I'm being stopped and scanned to see whether I'm a bot. I'm not sure sometimes. But also sort of non-internet companies like management, recruitment, these are also algorithmic intermediaries. These are computational systems that are mediating social relations, where we're relying on algorithmic systems to sort of shape them and to enable us to connect to one another and to share information and action with one another. So this is a lot. I'm intending to cast, like, there's a lot to kind of take in for political philosophy, and I'm intending to cast a wide net. If you want to sort of pin it down and have a clear example in your mind throughout, you won't go wrong if you think about digital platforms. Okay, digital platforms are paradigmatic algorithmic intermediaries. They have significant impacts on our lives. So if you think about whether it be Google, Facebook, I often think about Twitter, RIP. But these are sort of, they're paradigmatic. They're not the only examples, but if you want to get to sort of keep something concrete in your mind, then that's a good one. Not all internet companies are algorithmic intermediaries, and not all algorithmic intermediaries are internet companies. So algorithmic management, for example, is a clear case of using computational systems to transmit communication and interaction between people. But this is most of the things that I'm talking about, most of the sort of the sociotechnical systems I'm describing are, in fact, private, for-profit systems that have been generated, within a few miles of where we stand. But this is not just about big tech. And this is an intentional thing. Like, I was trying to think about what is the right kind of level of analysis for political philosophy coming at this problem. There is some work, and I've done some work, which is sort of focused on kind of engaging with and critiquing big tech as it stands now. But what I wanted to do in this project was rather sort of try to identify, the underlying structures that are represented at the moment by a particular configuration, sort of economic configuration, but which will be realized differently at different times. And even in the course of writing this essay, if you think about sort of the market capitalization of Meta now versus a year and a half ago, and where OpenAI, on the other hand, has come from and where it is now in those terms, and in terms of its influence, there are these fluctuations in the fortunes of these different companies. What I want to do as a political philosopher is to try and see what kind of underpins those. And so the model of social relations that I'm describing, where the ways in which we interact with and communicate with one another are mediated through these algorithmic intermediaries, is not unique to this particular economic configuration. It also describes what's happening in China with a sort of techno-authoritarianism, and it describes sort of other aspects of our kind of our digital lives now. So the Fediverse, that was something I hadn't heard of, to be honest, before when I started writing this essay, and which is now a big sort of looms large in my mind. Decentralized technologies like decentralized finance, decentralized autonomous organizations. Web3, if Web3 ever becomes more than a slogan. The metaverse, likewise. But also sort of more positive visions for the future, like digital democracy, and this idea of AI as a universal intermediary. These are all examples of cases where what we've got is people relating to one another in a way that is now mediated by computational systems. So that's the thing I want to zero in on, and I want sort of front and center in all of your minds. Okay, so that's the picture, the empirical kind of target. Okay, and I want to think about how to sort of apply political philosophy to this new target. And I think that the first task of political philosophy, when evaluating changed social relations, is to think about how they change relations of power. And now, that's not the only question that political philosophy can answer, but it is a really important one. And you'll see why I think it's important in a minute. It has to do with these foundational values of liberty, equality, and collective self-determination. So let me tell you what I mean by power roughly: one-way control. So the ability to shape others' behavior. And that can be through directly impacting on them, harming or benefiting them. It can be through shaping their options, making them possible or impossible, attractive, unattractive, and through shaping their beliefs and desires. So the starting point is to say that algorithmic intermediaries exercise power over us in each of these ways, right? So, they have direct impacts. So this can be just any of the things which you've all talked about, I'm sure, many, many times here, about how AI can benefit and can harm people. So surveillance might be an example. Or Google changes its search algorithm and your business goes from being on page 1 and being viable, being on page 10 and being non-viable. That's where algorithmic intermediaries directly affect people's interests and prospects. Perhaps a slightly more interesting way in which they do that is by shaping our options, making some things possible, other things impossible. This is something that Larry Lessig called attention to, and others sort of late in the 90s and early 2000s, about the way in which code can regulate behavior, right? Making some things possible, making some things impossible, something's easy, something's hard. And we see this with computational systems. So quick check, I guess everyone in this room has probably used ChatGPT at some point. Put your hands up if you've been, if ChatGPT has not answered a question for you because it's sort of, you're being naughty. Come on, be honest. No, yeah, because it thinks you're being naughty. It's like, it won't respond, right? You're being governed, okay? That's algorithmic governance. Okay, way more of you have, I know. Maybe if I'd said DALL-E, it would be different. So that's like making something's possible and something's impossible. You can't generate a response to a certain kind of prompt within the system. Another nice example is in Facebook's Horizons, or Meta's Horizons virtual world, where they introduced a 4-foot boundary around avatars, so that it was impossible to kind of approach the personal space of another avatar without their consent. That's another kind of power over, where you're removing options. Roger Brownsword calls this, who's at KCL, calls this technological management. So there are all these ways in which algorithmic intermediaries exercise power over us. Okay. Even more important are the ways in which they shape power relations between us. And this is really important because often we think about, and when people are writing kind of critically about technology, describe it as though there's this sort of digital thumb that's pressing us down that we need to sort of push back against. But actually, most of the time when things go wrong with algorithmic intermediaries, it's often to do with stuff that we do to one another. Right? So social media is the obvious example of this. People worry about whether the algorithm is manipulating people. Not sure, but it's clear that some people are manipulating other people. Some people are deceiving other people. Some people are bullying or brigading other people. Right? So algorithmic intermediaries can shape these power relations. They make it possible or impossible to do these things. To see this, you only need to see the way in which Twitter has changed since the acquisition by Elon Musk. That's a perfect example of, like, at one time there was a certain kind of set of social relations between people, certain kind of power relations between people. Elon Musk changes things, and then it completely switches in the other direction. And loads of people get basically crowded off the platform, either because they're being brigaded or because people are abusing the reporting system in order to get out people of different political views. So algorithmic intermediaries shape power relations between us. That's really important. Equally important is the fact that by shaping our social relations over time, they actually significantly impact on our broader social structure. So this is an area where some of the work in sociology and communication studies is particularly useful. There's a bunch of references in the essay about kind of supporting this thesis. But in each of these areas of politics, sociality, culture, education, like how many people, like, quick hands up, how many people have been in meetings about ChatGPT and plagiarism? Anyone here? Okay, yeah, good few of you. Thanks, OpenAI. Yeah, so reshaping education, reshaping culture. Now, I want to be very, very clear. This is not like a one-way deterministic thing. Like algorithmic intermediaries don't just kind of operate on us in a way that just shapes us and would shape anybody, any other society the same way. What's happening is, there's a complicated interplay of push and pull from us and from the things that the tools that we use. But I think it's very clear that society has been very significantly changed by these systems in a way that it's really hard to do intentionally. Changing social structures is really difficult. Okay, so we've got the picture, the target phenomenon, the algorithmic city. I've told you that it involves these new and intensified power relations. So what do we do about it? Right? My role as a political philosopher is to come up with sort of normative stuff to say about it. So there's two ways to look at this. First of all, anytime there are new and intensified power relations, they raise new practical questions. This is true in general with new technologies. They create new capacities, and you've got to figure out whether and how to use those capacities. But I think there's also a way in which the nature of algorithmic intermediary power invites a certain kind of theoretical progress too. This is a little bit in the weeds for the computer scientists in the audience. I'll be able to talk about it more, I hope, in the Q&A and the discussion. But I want to draw this contrast between what I call extrinsic power and intermediary power. So extrinsic power operates from the outside. It governs social relations from the outside in. It creates boundaries and barriers within which you operate. They might be laws, right? So a law that provides a sort of a baseline of permissible conduct below which you mustn't fall. Or it might be about creating a space, like with a marketplace, for example, right? And these two things can work together, for example, with the marketplace of ideas notion. So that's extrinsic power, and it usually operates through law and architecture. And it is not uniquely, but it is certainly often the province of the state. Intermediary power is slightly different. So I have this metaphor from Dewey that runs through my mind. So John Dewey, where he talks about governance as being, he analogizes it to the way the river's banks govern the flow of the water. Okay, that's how he thinks about governance. It sort of channels behavior. Okay, that's extrinsic power. So if that's extrinsic power, then intermediary power is much more like the way in which the molecular bonds form the water molecule. Right? It operates from the inside out, not from the outside in. It shapes what's possible and impossible in the way that it constitutes the social relationships that it mediates. It frustrates some things, it encourages others, makes some things easy, some things hard. It does this through design in a way that can preempt choices and enable sort of perfect recording and monitoring to enable sort of perfect post hoc enforcement. So this, I think, is an interesting feature of intermediary power that is brought to the fore by algorithmic intermediaries. It, like I said, governs social relations from the inside out. It's not unique to algorithmic intermediaries. There are other intermediaries, and there always have been, and they have been able to exercise power. So that sort of reliable trope, which is used in Game of Thrones, where the translator will sort of translate only part of what is said, and then at some point, obviously, the person reveals that they actually understand the language that's being translated. Like that's just, that kind of power is always there for an intermediary. And I think that actually analytical political philosophy, the kind of work that I do, has never really taken this sort of power seriously. Continental philosophy derived from Foucault has thought about it to a certain degree, and some philosophers of technology have for sure. So if you think about the way Foucault talks about language and the power that language has or the power that discourse has, it's too a way of sort of saying that these things that mediate between us shape what's possible for us. And if you look at the work of people like Winner and Mumford on the affordances of technologies, they also talk about how tools shape what's possible. But analytical political philosophy has been sort of fairly ignorant on this part. But I do think there's something interestingly new about algorithmic intermediaries. And it's important to qualify what I mean by interestingly new, right? Because in one sense, at a certain level of abstraction, there's nothing new under the sun. There's three moral concepts, and they apply to everything. Or if you're a utilitarian, there's one. So whatever, everything else is just an applied version of that. And then there's another level of abstraction where everything is new every moment. Like right now, that was just new. Okay, and that's obviously not interesting either, right? There's a sense in which it's true. So where's the sort of level of interesting novelty? And I think there's something interestingly new about algorithmic intermediaries in a way because they extend and perfect intermediary power. So take comparisons. So the law can be an intermediary. It can make some things possible, some things impossible. You can't get married except in the way that the law makes it possible for you to do so. But you can have like the physical correlate of a marriage. You can have everything that is descriptively the same as it, just without the legal recognition. So the law can control that legal recognition. That can be really important, but it can't shape whether the underlying substrate is possible. But algorithmic intermediaries, computational systems, they can do that. They can make it literally possible or impossible for you to do something. Human intermediaries can shape your behavior. They can extract information. They can shape your beliefs and desires. But they can only do so at a pretty limited speed and scale, like a door-to-door salesperson or a realtor or even a newspaper editor has a limit to the ability to deploy their kind of framing of relations, social relations, at a massive scale. Well, that's not true with algorithmic intermediaries that are, where a single sort of flick of a switch, metaphorically speaking, by Mark Zuckerberg can change the news feed and change the way that people relate to information and one another for 2.5 billion people, probably going down now, but at 2.7 billion people. So they can operate at that kind of scale. But then I think the thing that's really interesting about them comes out of the comparison with Foucault and with Winner and Mumford and this pre-existing idea of intermediary power, which is that what's possible for us. It's that they are, as I said before, they're agential. They're able to adapt and dynamically update in response to new information about whether it be the people that they're mediating between or the circumstances. So there's a sort of a quality that's different from what Foucault was talking about, what Winner and Mumford were talking about, where for them, the kind of power that was at stake in those cases was much more sort of structural. It was a feature of the artifact, or it was a feature of language. And that's why with Foucault and with language, it was never made much sense to do sort of directed normative critique. There wasn't like an agent who you could task with fixing the ways in which language enables some to exercise power over others. But here there is. The ways in which these algorithmic intermediaries mediate social relations is something that is subject to agential control, to a certain degree by the algorithmic systems themselves. I know that's controversial, but obviously by the people who design them. And it's super complex, it's really hard to do, but they are able to adapt and dynamically update in response to the goals that are imparted to them. And that's different, and it means that they're subject to a kind of direct normative evaluation, which might be less appropriate when we're just thinking of structures or artifacts on their own. Okay, which leads us to the question of what do we do about this kind of power? Okay, how do we justify it? Should we justify it? And here again, I said at the start that one of the roles of political philosophy can be to help us sort of dig deeper into our normative critiques of new technologies, say. And there's definitely some people who think that just naming power is enough to criticize it. That's sufficient. Once you've said power, then we know it's bad, right? But that's not true generally. I mean, there's forms of power that are justified. My power over my kids, for example, such as it is. It would be justified for me to have power over my children. Let me put it that way. Though they don't agree. I think that we can do better than this, and we can dig into the reasons that underlie the suspicion of new power relations. I'm going to do it very quickly. I go into it in more depth in the paper. But it comes back to those values of liberty, equality, and collective self-determination that I mentioned. And I think each of these values gives us reason to be presumptively suspicious of new relations of power. That doesn't mean that they're absolutely wrong. It just means there's a reason for why people are skeptical. So if A has power over B, then presumptively that undermines B's liberty by subjecting them at the very least to the risk of wrongful interference. That's what liberty is one of the aspects of liberty is protection against the risk of wrongful interference. If A has power over B, then they stand in, presumptively, they stand in hierarchical social relations. A has power over B. That's contrary to the underlying ideals of relational equality, the idea that, as Nico Kolodny says, that there should be rule over none. And if A has power over B, C, and D, then, again, presumptively, A, B, C, and D together are not collectively self-determining. Okay, so if one person has power over the three of us, if Sam Altman's decision to release ChatGPT, as he has, puts all of the rest of us on the hook for coming up with new policies with regard to plagiarism, then we're not collectively deciding how we're going to handle these sorts of problems, okay? And so the next step is, okay, so there's a presumptive objection. Without something to countervail it, we might have reason to just eliminate algorithmic intermediary power. And there's definitely some kinds of power relations where that's just what we should do. It's hard for me to see how anybody could think that, the power that Rupert Murdoch has over politics here in Australia, and well, less in Australia this year. They got kind of stuffed, and it was really good. But the amount of power that he has over politics in this country and in the UK, how that could ever be justified. I don't think a just society would have that kind of power. But I don't think that's the way to think that we should think about algorithmic intermediary power. I don't think the task is to eliminate it for three reasons. First, I think it's just super implausible that relating to one another through algorithmic intermediaries is the kind of thing that we could just permissibly outlaw. Right? It's not like contracting into slavery. Maybe it's bad in some ways, but it isn't that bad. And people like doing it, so it's going to happen. So there's going to be algorithmic intermediaries that exercise power over people. So we've got to figure out, the conditions under which that can be permissible. More importantly, we relate to one another because we relate to one another so significantly through these systems now. It's incredibly important that there be an agent that is exercising power within those contexts to ensure that we maintain egalitarian social relations among us, to prevent us from manipulating and deceiving and abusing one another. Right? That's a really important role these things need to play. We need someone to govern these digital spaces. And in many cases, that can only be done directly through the algorithmic intermediary. It can be indirectly kind of mandated through state regulation. But in terms of the actual practical implementation of it, that has to be done on platform. So there's a really important role there. And then the last thought is just that, I said that algorithmic intermediaries are able to kind of reshape social structures over time. We don't have a lot of tools that can do that intentionally. That's not an easy thing to do. It's really hard. And so far, they've been deployed in such a way as to sort of maximize value for a certain set of owners and founders and shareholders. But imagine if it was used for good and to realize kind of collective social value. That would be extraordinary. And it's a sort of a power that we shouldn't leave on the table. So then I think there are grounds for thinking that, especially governing algorithmic intermediary power, algorithmic governance, the topic of the two lectures as a whole, we want to be able to find ways in which it could be justified. We have reason not to just eliminate it. So then the question is, well, by what means? What does that look like? Okay, so here I've got a simple formula or approach to justifying governing power that kind of brings together a bunch of threads in political philosophy. The first step is to answer what I call the what question of substantive justification. Right, so I've told you that there are these presumptive objections. I've told you that there's some good that we could do. So maybe you then just say, well, let's just, cost-benefit analysis. Let's realize the good things, minimize the bad things. That's the sort of basic trope of any number of grant proposals or policy proposals or anything to do with technology and society. I'm sure you've seen plenty of these. But that might override the presumptive objections from liberty, equality, and collective self-determination. It might give you enough kind of good on one side that you might think, well, okay, we go ahead with it. But it doesn't resolve them. They persist as kind of moral thorns in the side that haven't been pulled out. Okay, it's better to resolve the objection than just override them, both because of that and also because, often enough, you're not actually achieving enough good to genuinely override the objection. So how do you resolve the objections? Well, that comes down to answering two other questions, the how and the who question. The how question has to do with procedural legitimacy, the way in which power is being exercised. Okay, this is a way of us kind of exerting power over those who have power over us. You have power over me, you have power over us, rather, and such that that sort of creates a hierarchy between us. But we have power over you because you can only use that power in accordance with certain clearly defined limits. And that's what procedural legitimacy is about. So we want to make sure that algorithmic governance is not only substantively justified, not only used to do the right things, but that it's also procedurally legitimate. But that also isn't sufficient. And as just an example of this, sort of out of the algorithmic space, think about the Facebook Oversight Board. Okay, really interesting institutional innovation. I think they've made some pretty substantively justified decisions. They are procedurally just chef's kiss, but their authority essentially comes from, I don't know, the fact that they were on Nick Clegg's reading list at some point. I mean, it's that's how it was originally formed. So Nick Clegg decided we could have this thing, and so they did it, and it's good. But their authority is derived from that. It doesn't derive any authority from the users of the platform or from democratic polities in general. It really matters who is exercising power. And that's a really important thing for people working on AI and society to remember, because it's not just a matter of I'm not just saying participatory design is good here. That's true, but it's sometimes true, but that's not the point. The point is that you have to think when you're making these big evaluative decisions in the design of technologies, whether you have the right and the authority to do so. And oftentimes we don't. So that's the task of this broad area of political philosophy that I kind of want to embark upon and launch and encourage others into. The idea is you've got to figure out what should algorithmic governance be used to do, how should it be used, and by whom. Okay, so that then leads me to the last degustation menu of the paper, where I argue that I think that because of the nature of algorithmic intermediary governance, it's going to invite us to rethink some questions in political philosophy. And the way to think about this is this, right? Political philosophy has basically been totally centered on, laser focused on one kind of exercise of power, evaluating and justifying that. There are obviously counterexamples, but this is a central question of political philosophy focused on justifying the state's exercise of extrinsic power by means of law. So the ways in which the state coerces us and how that can be justified. Algorithmic governance operates in different ways. It shapes your beliefs and desires. It removes some options, makes some feasible, some infeasible, makes some frustrate, some harder. I'll talk specifically about the kind of dimensions of that, but it's just kind of interestingly different. And what happens when you have a set of normative theories that are tailored for a particular space of possibilities, and then you just expand the space of possibilities, is that it's kind of an interesting question as to whether those normative theories will just transfer that new area. It's kind of a problem of transfer learning in a way. What I think is likely to happen as we do that is that we're going to discover stuff that we didn't know before. We're going to discover stuff about the justification of the power of the state, where we take in certain practical features as like parametric, sort of shaping what's possible, and so we haven't thought about kind of alternatives. So we're going to discover stuff about the power of the state, and then we're going to discover interesting things about the power of algorithmic intermediaries. And one of the things I'll do in this last little bit is just a little bit of compare and contrast. Like, where are the ways in which it sort of seems, other things equal, easier to satisfy the what, who, and how questions if you're doing extrinsic governance by law or intermediary governance by way of algorithmic intermediaries. So this will be a whistle-stop tour, but it will be fun. There is a silly example in there. Okay, let's start with authority and preemption. So like I said, your central question for political philosophy, some people call it the central question for political philosophy, is, do I have an obligation to obey the law? Is the state's authority justified? Does law have authority? This comes up in all of the central texts in analytical political theory over the last 50-odd years. And obviously it has much deeper roots as well. The interesting thing about algorithmic governance and algorithmic intermediaries is that they're able to govern without law or coercion. So in the extreme, this can be just through preempting choices, only enabling permissible options, not enabling impermissible ones. This is something that Jonathan Zittrain called a long time ago preemptive governance. It's also in the work of Murray Hildebrandt around the same sort of time, and also, of course, in Larry Lessig's work. The interesting thing, I guess, about algorithmic intermediary governance is that it can be kind of personalized, updated, revised, responsive. Regulation by design has always existed. You can prevent people from going into a room by making a law that says don't go into the room, or by locking the room. Right? You can use physical artifacts in order to shape behavior. It's just vastly easier to do that within computational systems where you're defining the environment as you go along. So let's just imagine, which I'm going to shout out to my postdoctors in the audience for the name, Preemptopolis. Preemptopolis is let's just sort of take the most optimistic vision on one sense of optimism for what the metaverse might be. You get up and get in, and then you spend the day in your virtual world. And let's say that in this virtual world, like, all impermissible options are just not enabled. You can't take anyone's property. It's just not an option that's available to you. You can't, incur on people's personal space without their consent because there are these boundaries. So in this world, there's no law, there's no coercion. It's not necessary because your behavior can be shaped just through technological management. This means that you don't have, like, there can be no obligation to obey the law. There's no option to disobey. Like, the obligation to obey the law presupposes that you have an option to disobey. But still, all of the questions of political justified authority clearly matter in this world, even more so, because it's sort of power is hidden. You don't know who's controlling everything. Whereas with the law, as I'll say in a minute, it has to be public. So this just suggests to me that this way of framing the central question of political philosophy has been insufficient, is just insufficiently general. We've thought about it as being about justifying the coercive power of the state. Actually, that's just one modality of governance among others. Now we see that there are other ways of governing using other different sort of technologies besides the law. We realize that there's a further kind of a higher or more fundamental question, which is not, what justifies the state's right to coerce, but what justifies the right to govern. That's the key thing that matters here. Governing, I should say, is making, implementing, and enforcing the constitutive rules of an institution. Okay, and that's the thing that's really at stake: is what justifies that governing power. I think that I won't do much of the compare and contrast in this one, but I think that actually realizing justified authority is going to be harder with algorithmic intermediaries than in the other case, largely because of the way in which power is obscured and it's so easy to hide. You can just make it sort of an invisible design choice that nobody has the opportunity to question. Okay, so I think that we need to rethink authority in order to handle different modalities of governance. I think something similar is true for procedural legitimacy, the how question. This is especially plausible because our theories of procedural legitimacy are almost all sort of more or less forms of legal proceduralism. Like they really derive from the fact that the way we exercise power is through the law. And so they're often about like making the law public in advance, applying it consistently in medias res, having accountability and contestability after the fact. It's all sort of defined in terms of what the main modality of governance that we have is. But algorithmic intermediaries, like I said, they exercise preemptive power. They also are able to do a sort of a very different kind of coercive power. Coercive power through law relies on kind of it goes through the will, right? If you had to sort of actively force people to obey with every one of your injunctions, again, I'm thinking about my children again here. Then it's like really, really costly and hard, and that's no good, right? What you need to do is you need to get them to actually want to stop using the iPad at that time, right? Need to get people to actually internalize norms rather than just sort of feel them as external kind of constraints. And that's a key feature of the law, but algorithmic governance needn't be like that. So I can remotely turn off my son's iPad from here. It enables us to sort of not invoke or invite people's will to be engaged. Anybody who's tried to stream a film from their phone to the TV, when like by all accounts it seems like you should be able to, but apparently somewhere in the copyright protections, some license that you've agreed to says that you've only rented it for the purposes of viewing on a mobile device and not on a static device, something like that. And they don't need to really tell you and make that clear because they don't need to go through your will because they can just disable that option for you. Okay. The same is interestingly true for kind of enforcement. You can monitor people's behavior on algorithmic intermediaries very easily. There's this interesting distinction between surveillance and capture that Paul Agre came up with, where stuff that's happening on platform can just be recorded and monitored and then automatically intervened against. This is especially true with, for example, the use of large language models in content moderation. Now, I think it's important to recognize that all of these technologies kind of suck in various ways and don't necessarily realize this sort of idealized goal of perfectible governance, but they certainly make it seem attainable and one that people might want to aim at. So there is interesting differences between algorithmic governance and extrinsic governance by law, and they invite us to sort of think, what are the underlying values that kind of motivate procedural legitimacy? For me, I think it has to do with the idea of ultimately limiting power. And then we get to look and see, like, how do algorithmic intermediaries fare relative to extrinsic governance? And I think this just, seemed to me like an interesting thing to realize was that the law has a kind of accidental virtue. And, in a way, this is a way of framing a central point in, Lon Fuller's morality of law. But I think that when we think about the justification of law in that context, we're not thinking about having alternatives. Like, if you've got two different ways of governing some particular domain, one virtue of governing by way of law is that in order for it to be effective, it has to be public. And then if it's public, then people can sort of demand a say over what laws govern them, and they can challenge them, they can resist them. That's an interesting virtue. Algorithmic intermediaries don't require that. They don't have to be public in order to function. And so you lose in particular this virtue of resistibility. And I don't mean sort of January the 6th style resistibility. I mean like civil disobedience style resistibility. I mean the fact that when laws are exercised in public, people are able to sort of respond to them, and if they think they're unjust, to sort of unify and to form sort of bonds of mutual trust in such a way that they can challenge them. With algorithmic systems, that's a lot harder. It's sort of you're an atomized individual. Maybe some of the people in this room are very smart and can sort of hack their way around systems of algorithmic governance. Get that video playing on their TV. But the whole point about algorithmic intermediaries is that they connect us with other people. And so while you might be able to have your sort of interstitial freedom from algorithmic governance, it's not possible to do it in such a way that you're actually connecting with all the other people that you want to connect with. That's the nature of platform power. So again, this is just sort of about highlighting the contrast between the ways in which we can govern through algorithmic systems and through legal systems. And in this case, there's just this interesting virtue of legal governance, that it is public and it affords resistibility, whereas algorithmic governance kind of can operate in secret. And you have to intentionally enable the possibility of resistance. It's important to be clear that these are just affordances. They're not sort of determinative. You can push against affordances. They don't just decide what the outcome will be. But if you're not aware of them, and if you don't think about them carefully, then you'll just sort of slide in the way that they direct you. Okay, so last, the what question of substantive justification. So there's this concept in political philosophy. It's not very fashionable now, but I think it still has some appeal to it, of justificatory neutrality. So when you're thinking about substantive justification, you're thinking about like what are the values that you can appeal to in order to when you're governing a polity. Okay, so another Game of Thrones reference, and because it's old, and because no one should watch season 8 anyway, I don't mind that there's a spoiler here. But there's a bit at the end of Game of Thrones where Daenerys and Robb are in. They're by the Iron Throne. She's achieved her objective, and she says to Jon, not Robb. She says to Jon, "I'm going to go and break the wheel. I'm going to realize justice everywhere." And he says, impression coming up, "Who decides? Who decides? What do they think that they've got their way?" And she says, "They don't get to decide, right?" And this is the point where she thinks she's substantively justified. She's she's on a moral campaign, and she just wants to go and use her power to realize justice everywhere. And Jon raises the very natural point that the other people can have different ideas of justice, and she's just prepared to kind of drive over them. So Jon, when he, puts the knife in, is being a political liberal. Right? He's saying that we shouldn't have people just imposing their substantive moral values on us. And when you govern, you should do so on the basis of reasons that are broadly speaking acceptable. And like justificatory neutrality is undoubtedly an impossible goal, but it's a reasonable ideal. And we all do it. We do. I mean, I'm sure many people here, when you're thinking about how to incorporate values into the systems that you're designing, you're looking for some kind of sense of how do we make sure that we're not just putting in our own particular perspective? That's an important thing to aim at. And I think the thing that's interesting here is that, again, there are ways in which governing by way of law makes it just slightly easier to aspire to justificatory neutrality than does governing by way of algorithmic intermediaries. So, in a nutshell, the idea is really this. Extrinsic power, like governing power through law, enables you to create kind of parameters or boundaries within which unmediated interaction can take place. So this is the idealized notion of a market or a marketplace. And the goal then is that you just sort of, you just need to get agreement on the boundaries, And that's still hard, but it's easier than having to get agreement on everything that goes on within them. So that's one part of it. And then another interesting feature of the law is that in the analog city, in the physical world, there's this sense in which there's a default of freedom of action. Like you don't need the law to tell you something is permissible. You do stuff, and you're able to move around, you're able to act sort of freely, and then law will tell you whether something is prohibited. Okay, and this means there's this interesting sort of middle ground that is possible with the law, where it's like something is legally permitted, it's not prohibited, but it isn't actively endorsed. It's just this is the default. People are able to do stuff unless it's prohibited. So this means the law can be more or less silent on something. Obviously, people disagree about how, whether that is really being silent. But if you're a deontologist like me, then you think that the way in which you causally relate to something is morally important. And it's different to endorse something or enable something versus just allowing something to happen and sort of even turning a blind eye to it, maybe, versus again prohibiting and preventing. Okay, so in these ways, we find that governing by way of law enables a certain kind of, it gives justificatory neutrality a boost, relatively speaking. And governing by way of algorithmic intermediaries does the reverse, makes it harder. So in a way, this is kind of a version of the general thing that people often say, technology isn't neutral. So that's definitely part of it. But more specifically, everything that happens in the algorithmic city has to be intentionally enabled by the algorithmic intermediaries that constitute it. Like, you don't have a sort of a default of freedom of action because you're interacting with one another through a constructed system. So, and this is something where anybody who's ever taken like an offline phenomenon and put it online, like doing online conferences in the start of the pandemic versus doing them in person. There are so many ways in which you have to think, oh crap, we need norms for this. That some of these norms are just given by the fact that we were in buildings with walls that create space between people and then like a corridor where people meet. And like, how do you replicate that in a digital context? Like, you're implicated in all of these different choices, and if you don't make them one way, then you're having significant impacts on things. So I think that this sort of way in which, when you're constituting an environment, you're responsible for every element of the environment is really important. And partly that is because it sort of removes this option of being silent about something. Because the default is unfreed, and the default is that you can't do something. So if you can do something, then it has to be positively enabled. And then if you want to prevent it from happening, you have to there's no difference between prohibiting it and not enabling, right? So it's just an interesting, subtle change. On the one hand, you've got the default is freedom. You can prohibit, or you can sort of permit without endorsing, or you can endorse. On the other hand, you've got the default is unfreedom. You can only enable, and enabling is effectively as good as endorsing. And then you've got prohibit or not enable as your two options. And I think it's pretty hard to see any difference between prohibiting and not enabling in terms of their moral significance. So I think that removes this option of kind of being silent about something, or it makes it harder to achieve. So again, justificatory neutrality is sort of a good ideal to aim at for substantive justification. It's just that little bit harder to achieve for algorithmic intermediaries than it is for extrinsic governance through law. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up in just a moment. There's a lot here. It's a huge paper. There's many more things to say. And in the essay, I can consider a bunch of objections to the argument, focusing on things like, whether we should really apply such stringent standards to the justification of algorithmic intermediary power in virtue of the fact that it's possible for you to sort of jump ship from any given platform and hop over to another one, right? So you have this power of exit. Why doesn't that mean that you don't need to apply these standards? Or one can argue that the stakes just aren't high enough here. Like, I'm talking about governance, but we're not talking about like the power of the state. The state can take away your life. It can take away your property, your freedom. Algorithmic intermediaries can take away your followers. It's not the same. But again, I have responses to that. I think that there are ways in which the stakes are interestingly high, but also where I think that this just forces us to think about, like, what is it about state power that actually generates these high demands of legitimacy and authority? And I also consider a set of objections concerning whether we should focus, like I do, on governance by algorithms, or whether we should be more centrally focused on governance of algorithms. I think the two things work together, but it's a valid concern to sort of think that I should be focusing on one more than the other. But I'm going to wrap up, and I want to leave you with just a few takeaways. Okay, so these are the things I want you to remember from tonight. There was an empirical bit. The algorithmic city is the network of algorithmically mediated social relations. And I asserted that political philosophers have largely ignored its arrival. There was a bit of social theory in there. I argued that algorithmic intermediaries exercise intermediary power over those they mediate between. They shape power relations between them. That's really important. And through them, they reshape society. I think the political philosophy has overlooked intermediary power in general, whether it be kind of now or in the past. New power relations, this was the start of the normative bit, aren't necessarily objectionable. But new governing relations are presumptively so. There's a hurdle they need to meet in order for them to sort of to resolve these objections based in liberty, equality, and collective self-determination. And the way that we do that is by appealing to these three standards: the what, the how, and the who standard. It's really important in that context that substantive justification is insufficient. So anytime you're talking with someone about, for example, aligning AI systems, and they're only talking about what those systems are going to do, they're only talking about substantive justification. The next question is, how will they exercise this power, and who has the right to exercise it? Do they have the right to exercise it? This is one of the reasons why I think that we shouldn't even take the design and sort of pursuit of AGI as like a regulative ideal. Whatever you think about how realistic it is as a target, I don't think we should want it, because it's so hard to see how it could satisfy the how and the who questions if it ever had real power. The fourth point was that there are some interesting differences between algorithmic intermediary governance and the kind of governance by law that the state does that we've mostly thought about in political philosophy. That will lead to some interesting reflections on the nature of these substantive questions, but also will invite us to think about whether, other things equal, things will vary in different cases, we have reason to be skeptical about the possibility of satisfying these standards with algorithmic intermediaries, that those reasons don't apply in the case of extrinsic governance by law. I think this does have one sort of normative upshot. On the whole, I mostly want to just try and give you resources with which to better answer the normative questions that we face collectively. But I do think there is one pretty substantive normative upshot, that we should be pretty skeptical about aspirations to increase the role of algorithmic governance in our lives, whether that be by aspiring to a value-aligned AGI, or whether it be some of these sort of ideas in for new approaches to kind of online social spaces like Web3 that rely heavily on the illusion and the aspiration towards perfectible governance. I think that the broader project of which this talk has been part, answering the what, the how, and the who questions for algorithmic governance, is the work of a whole subfield of what I'm calling normative philosophy of computing. In lecture 2, I'm going to apply this methodology to evaluate a particular area, so the algorithmic distribution of attention in the digital public sphere. But that's just the start of a much bigger project, one that goes much beyond my own work. So this can't be a conclusion. There's far too much to do. So instead, I'll just stop.
We'll have now some comments from Professor Marian Prasad, and then a short time for Q&A before we break.
So it is a very special honor to be commenting on this lecture by Cés Lazare, and even more to do so at Stanford, where some of the processes that Cés analyzes with such great care, of course, were started. And I want to thank Rob Reich and the Tanner Lecture on AI Committee for thinking of me in this context. It is also a distinct pleasure to be here in the flesh. Cés and I jointly co-chair the Pandemic Era 2021 AI Ethics and Society Conference, but we have never met in person. And actually, Arvind was the keynote speaker at that same conference. So today is a reunion of sorts, intellectually to be sure, because we have already recognized each other as interlocutors who appreciate, each other's work. But it is also a reunion on a molecular level, thanks to the now increasingly rare event of being physically co-present. The pandemic, of course, firmly relocated our professional lives to a digital city, a complex and round-the-clock space of flows that bustles with activity and is spread out unevenly around the globe. Like Cés, I do not mean city literally. The city here is a metaphor, a model that stands in for the global network of computer-mediated social relations, to paraphrase Cés' description in the opening of the first lecture. What he calls the algorithmic city, the subject of his lecture today, should be conceived as a subset of the digital city. It is constituted by those social relations that transit by way of what he calls algorithmic intermediaries. The definitions are precise and the words are carefully chosen. This is philosophy, after all. I wish you could read the whole lecture because it is quite an analytical tour de force. It is built like clockwork, and I think you could really see that in the way that he delivered it. Most significant and most interesting to a sociologist like me is Sess's careful conceptualization of what he calls the constitutive power of algorithmic intermediaries on social relations. I guess that's why it was called social relations. He argues that this power bears two fundamental characteristics. It is preemptive and it intermediates. The first characteristic brings up a comparison with the law. The second characteristic brings up a comparison with other conceptualizations of social relations. So let me discuss each of these in turn. By preemptive power, Sess means that technology endorses some ways for people to act on one another, while making other ways not simply undesirable and liable to sanction the way the law does, but technically impossible. We are not talking about brute external repressive force, but neither are we talking about what Michel Foucault calls governmentality, the power to arrange things in such a way that people will subjectively align with the demands of what Haggerty and Erickson call the surveillant assemblage. For the process of subjectification to take place, Foucault's analysis has to assume the existence of an agency, a subjectivity to be trained. And what strikes me in Sess's description of the specificity of algorithmic power in its preemptive dimension, and I want to emphasize that in that dimension alone, is that it actually bypasses human subjectivity entirely. In other words, algorithms have no use for a free or even trainable human agent who can make their own determination of whether a norm ought to be followed. The rigidity embedded in the technology is in some ways an affront to our freedom, to our humanity, all the more, of course, since that rigidity is not sui generis, but the result of a design decision. Of course, the law constrains us too, but the law at least can be broken. By contrast, code rules in this more inflexible manner. Compliance is ensured by default, much like a straitjacket or a prison wall would. The built environment actually offers a good analogy because, like code, it is man-made. I was reminded of Langdon Winner's famous discussion of the decision by city planner Robert Moses to build low highway overpasses in New York City. This prevented public buses and therefore the racialized poor from traveling to local beaches prized by the white middle classes. The public infrastructure was engineered to keep these two populations apart until, that is, the poor started being able to afford cars too. Similarly, algorithms make some ways for humans to relate to one another possible and other impossible. Sess's canonical example in the paper is actually that you just cannot hug a friend in Meta Horizon's virtual world. The reason is that in the virtual world, as in the social one, the line between hugging and groping is a fine one. Both involve a shrinking of personal space. Meta has no way of enforcing a rule specifically against groping, except for going through the labor-intensive and therefore very expensive work, or of making that determination and, of course, policing individual harassers. The preemptive default, the 4 feet safety bubble for avatars in Horizons, must be understood, therefore, first and foremost, as a particularly economical and efficient way of managing a real problem. And importantly, it does not solve other aspects of a virtual assault, like offensive talk, and threatening gestures, which can still accompany the avatar, right? You can have all the personal space you want, if somebody's talking to you offensively, you'll hear it. There does not seem to exist a preemptive fix to that. And there might come a time when the use of certain words will automatically boot the person off the platform, but we are not there yet. Preemption must be contextualized in light also of, a longer history. The internet, and especially the gaming world, which would be particularly attracted to virtual environments like Horizons, is awash with harassment and bullying. We know that. There is pornography, obscenity, hatred, and lies. After years of finding themselves sinking ever deeper into the ocean stable of content moderation, tech companies have gotten cautious. Certain forms of preemptive governance come out of that history. So I think it's important to sort of contextualize that. So, for instance, the image generation program DALL-E will not let users generate a pornographic or offensive image. Likewise, the text generation program ChatGPT will not allow them to produce a defense of fascism. I tried. Preemptive power, of course, does not inhere in computer code, but code is the medium through which designers of online products exert it. And as such, it is subject to the kind of thoughtful societal feedback that Seth is calling for at the end of his lecture. After facing criticism about the personal safety boundary, in March 2022, Meta made it possible for users to disable it for their friends, or if they so choose, for everyone. Stability AI has actually opted for a different governance regime than OpenAI, with open source code that lets users build what they want. In this case, the source code has some safety protections to prevent unsavory or hateful products, but because it is made available, these protections can be easily hacked and bypassed. The same way we can, despite the legal prohibition, run a red light or take a one-way street in the forbidden direction. More generally, if your preferred program or service does not allow you to do something, chances are there exists one that will, somewhere in the darker corners of the web. In other words, the algorithmic city is a patchwork of neighborhoods. Some of them more strictly governed than others. Even in authoritarian environments where code has been weaponized for political repression, such as China, built-in constraints on communication can be circumvented with appropriate technological roundabouts. So this suggests three conclusions on the question of preemption, which can be taken as so many moderations on Seth's argument, which I find compelling, but I think the moderations are useful. First, the inflexibility of code relative to law should not be overrated because of this multiplicity of environments. Meta's version of the metaverse may not be someone else's, and today's version of Meta's code may not be tomorrow's. Second, exclusion, or what Seth calls the inability to do something, as the default mode of governing in the algorithmic city makes sense under certain specific economic conditions only. It is because other possibilities, like content moderations, are prohibitively expensive. Three, the proprietary nature of code, as in the Meta and the OpenAI cases, is actually one important way that the strictest preemptive character of code is constituted. And I shall return to this point at the end of my comments. So let me now move to the second point around mediation, or intermediation rather. The example that Seth gives of the forbidden virtual hug raises another question about the intermediary power of algorithms, what we could call, with Foucault, their productive power. In Seth's argument, algorithms shape how we live together, how we access others, how we interact and communicate with them. It's the flip side of the argument about exclusion. I know I cannot hug others in virtual space, but what is it that I can or indeed must do? What is explicitly allowed and encouraged and channeled? So for that, let me recall Seth's very elegant tripartite typology of power configurations in algorithmic mediations, which I find very, very useful. The first type is power over. For instance, a piece of code determines whether my carefully designed homepage, rather than some trash talk recorded on an obscure website, will appear at the top of the Google search algorithm. I am painfully aware that my job application or my dating prospects may depend on it. Power between. A piece of code decides who gets to show me something on Instagram. I have chosen many people in this network, but many others who get to connect with me via ads or recommendations are unknown to me. And yet they have this power over me because of the algorithmic mediation. It's the between power. Power through. A piece of code tells me something important that perhaps changes the way I think about the world or about myself. So for instance, if TikTok's algorithm keeps serving me videos that celebrate, for instance, being trans, that is, if it connects me to people who define themselves as trans, then maybe that will teach me something about sexuality in general, and perhaps even about my own sexuality in particular. So in that way, TikTok's algorithm may shape the evolution of identities and culture. So I find this extremely useful. But at the same time, I wanted to offer some concrete examples here because I think concreteness is sociologically relevant. Here's the thing that actually jumped at me when I read the lecture. This was a piece about power. And yet the entities in these power relations bore, for the most part, an abstract and impersonal character. For instance, Seth loosely models various counts of power relationships between A and B, right? But who A and B are, sociologically speaking, does not matter to the way that he poses the problem, or only marginally. And of course, a sociologist was going to jump at that. I'm sorry, Seth. The entities in the relations he describes are devoid of particularities. Power flows actually squarely from the pattern of communication and interaction. So there's a configurational orientation, if you will, in the talk. And that, I think, that derives from Seth's own definition of social relations as rooted in the network of interpersonal connection. He's interested in the nature of the connection much more than in that of the nodes. Translated into sociological jargon, Seth's formalization of the problem reproduces the characteristic anti-categorical imperative of network analysis. Abstracting away sociological differences helps with formal clarity, to be sure, but it is not analytically neutral. It helps shine a bright light on some problems, but it obfuscates others. So for instance, a bright light, on the bright light side, you find Seth's abiding concern about freedom, manipulation, disinformation, which are really present in the talk. That arises, I think, directly from this framework. He worries, as we all should, about privacy and self-determination and self-fulfillment. This is incidentally all very much in line with the philosophy of John Dewey, whom Seth cites a lot, and who has a similarly interactive view of society as a web of person-to-person relationships mediated by communication. But such a method, I would argue, also obscures other, and I would say darker, aspects of social life. And as such, it might impoverish our imagination when it comes to identifying the problems that may arise in the algorithmic city. To put it simply, the algorithmic city is not made of formal agents. It is made of people in flesh and blood who not only look, talk, behave, and live in widely different ways, but who also occupy vastly different positions in the social structure. Some are rich, some are poor. Some manage, some are managed. Some are in, some are out. Finally, people already relate to each other directly or indirectly through these differences. So in the next section of my talk, I would like to take a step sideways and ask, what would happen if we decided to apply what I will call a structural lens to the study of social relations, right? And the way that algorithmic mediation shaped them. So here I would propose my own definition, the structural power of algorithm. By that, I mean the way that algorithms shape the distribution of resources in society. It is a little bit different, but not unrelated. This is another way of saying that algorithms are implicated in the formation and reproduction of inequalities. I am not arguing here that algorithms make inequalities worse. That's actually, I believe very firmly, that it's a matter for case-by-case empirical investigations. But they certainly make inequalities different, and understanding how they do is essential. To be fair, SES does not ignore this broader framework. In a reference to a paper I published with Jenna Burrell, SES writes on page 4, quote, "The algorithmic city is different from the society of algorithm," the term that Jenna Burrell and I use. "The latter concept aims to encompass every way algorithmic systems infuse society at large. Political philosophy must urgently address the full gamut of algorithmic impacts on our social lives, but the algorithmic city focuses on one specific dimension, the network of social relations mediated by algorithmic intermediaries." I wavered a lot about whether to even address this quote. This lecture is not about me, after all, but it bugs me in two particular ways. One, it dismisses the whole of political economy on account that it is too much to chew on. This, in turn, allows us to pretend that we can reduce social relations to people relations, or more seriously, that people-to-people relations exist outside of the social structure. The truth is they don't. So the question is, how might this structure change concretely? What are the ways in which it changes as a result of the influence of algorithmic intermediaries? So let me illustrate the point through two examples. First example is how algorithmic intermediaries reconstitute how we live together by reconstituting property relations. And the second is how they change how we live together by allocating people to social positions and changing the way in which this allocation takes place. On the first point, we must interrogate not simply how algorithms are designed, but also by whom and for whose benefit. And you did mention that. But if we look at them this way, as objects of property rather than simply as technical communicative mediations, we see a new economic structure emerging, one that is organized around the ownership or lack thereof of code. In the Society of Algorithm, Jenna Burrell and I discussed the emergence of a basic social divide between what we call the coding elite, and on the other hand, the cybertariat, which supports it through wage and non-wage labor, including the unacknowledged labor of producing the data that feeds the algorithms. But that fundamental social relation is the very condition of possibility of algorithmic mediation. When people relate to one another by way of an algorithm, they relate by way of a form of capital that multiplies itself through that very relation between them, right? So the more a message says on Discord, and let's be modern, even if that's not true, I know my kids use Discord. So the more a message says on Discord, the more Discord knows about both of us, right? So what this means is that the algorithm's owners have a peculiar interest in corralling and closing, and especially in intensifying our social relation, right? The algorithmic intermediary is generally structured so as to meet these objectives. So when we think about the power that algorithms may have over me, we should think not only about the ways that they shape my social life, which we discussed extensively, but also about the power that the owners of the algorithm acquire by virtue of their capital expanding through me and CES, right? So in other words, algorithmic intermediaries reconstitute more than sociality. They rebuild how economic power operates. And I think that's important. When we're thinking about social relations, we should also think about them structurally. I will now turn to my second example. Algorithms are allocative mechanisms. One of their most important functions is to sort and slot people into categories of performance, deservingness, risk, desirability, and likeness. In that task, they promise to be inclusive. That is, they try to bring everyone under their purview. They promise to be objective. They know no personal favorite, they're machines after all, right? And they promise to be efficient. They work fast all the time and for a fraction of the cost of people, right? That is why, indeed, we use them. That's a big deal, right? CES correctly remarks that these qualities are not sufficient to establish their legitimacy, and he's right. For algorithmic intermediaries to be granted the right to govern us, we must govern them. That is, we must demand that they abide by certain rules. And he then proceeds to offer a rich set of principles for the governance of algorithmic intermediaries, which you have just heard. But the stubborn sociological reality is this. No matter how sophisticated the procedural guardrails or how pure the intentions, algorithmic methods never fully succeed at doing away with a social structure. That is, the residual of the history of exclusion, stigmatization, and exploitation that structures present-day institutions and patterns of behaviors across social groups and categories. And of course, time and again, sociologists and legal scholars and others and computer scientists are finding that these patterns, right, these social differences stand in the way of algorithmic fairness. And you find that in practically every domain. Now, this does not mean that, progress hasn't been or cannot be made, but it means that, there's something that will always bump against that, there's a hard constraint on that ideal of governability, and it is that inherited, those inherited social inequalities. This, in turn, motivates a second and final point. Because they classify and allocate positions through, in a very particular way, through quantitative rankings and scores, algorithmic intermediaries help institutionalize what Fabien Community calls a hierarchical gaze at the heart of all social relations. In other words, algorithms, they normalize a view of the world in which people relate to one another through quantified comparisons. That's the main change that they affect, right? Numbers of followers, credit score, personal rating, my Uber driver, fitness score, and much more, right? So as I've argued elsewhere, this implicit celebration of orderliness and quantified difference makes it quite difficult to see what it is that we all share, right? It changes the way we live together in that it makes it hard to treat each other as equals. If the whole point is to look for difference, right? Is to look for the smallest difference between us. It's hard to treat each other as equals who are equally worthy, and consequently to envision and build the solidaristic institutions that will reflect these beliefs. Instead, what we are seeing with algorithms is personalization and individualization proceeding apace in sector after sector, from insurance to work to education, chipping away at the common soul and leaving us where we thought we would never be in a hyper-connected world, increasingly alone, facing the algorithm. And sadly, a virtual hug is not the solution.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Fourcade. If I could invite the both of you to come up and join us here. Seth, I'm going to ask your indulgence now to refrain from an immediate response to these stimulating comments, since we'll have ample time at the discussion seminar. And would like to solicit a few questions from the audience. So I'll bring you a microphone. If you can raise your hands, I'll come on by. I'll come back here in a minute. Why don't we begin here with you? If you give us your name and then your question, be lovely.
Hi, thank you very much. That was excellent and very thought-provoking. And my name is David. I'm a student at the GSB. So at the intersection of law and algorithms and the hierarchy of which should govern which, what about situations where the coercive power of law isn't up to the task of prohibiting or curbing unjust actions, thanks to the algorithmic decisions made in jurisdictions with a set of normative and legal behaviors that differ from the jurisdiction where the harm is being caused? Based on reporting by Max Fisher in the New York Times on the role that Facebook played in the Sri Lankan anti-Muslim riots, Facebook algorithms reportedly accelerated posts about an invented threat by Muslims to dose the population with sterilization drugs. And this led to rapidly spreading riots that resulted in the murder of Muslims. Facebook had previously responded to the government officials' request to deal with the dangerous posts by claiming that the hate speech didn't violate Facebook's community standards. It was only when the government used its power to shut down social media sites that Facebook actually got in contact with the officials. Fisher points out that the root cause is there where people do not feel they can rely on police or the courts to keep them safe. That research shows that the panic over a perceived threat can lead some to take matters into their own hands. And I'll point out that Sri Lanka is Asia's oldest democracy. So what principles of communicative justice should govern that kind of intersection between algorithms and law?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I will actually talk a little bit about things like that tomorrow, but what it raises is this question of proper authority. So, where is the source of the authority to govern? Like, where does it come from? And my standard approach to that is always grounded in democratic authorization. I think that authority comes from we the people, and there's an obvious problem that arises when you have this sort of these transnational platforms that don't overlap with any particular democratic quality. One can reach for ideals of platform democracy. Not sort of some silly poll that's just flooded by bots, but there are genuine proposals for how to achieve a kind of platform democracy. The problem is that most people don't particularly want to spend their time on the internet sort of figuring out what norms to be governed by. So in that event, I think that the degree to which we come to, or the role that these platforms play in our lives, sort of creates a balance that has to tip at some point. At some point, even if we don't want to, we need to have a certain measure of democratic governance over these things. Prior to that point, it can be possible for authority to be justified on the grounds of there being no better alternative available. And that's one of the ways in which people justify the power of the state, is on a sort of more or less Samaritan grounds. No one else is going to do it. No one else is able to do it better. So someone has to govern. So the state's going to do it. And so there's a sort of, at the very least, a kind of pro tem ground for saying that like the authority can come from the platform if they're the only ones that have the ability to do it. But it's a very sort of unsatisfying outcome because of how it just sort of just doesn't mesh with the underlying democratic ideals that we have. Obviously, another approach is to have appropriate regulation within each country, and that's certainly an aspiration. And I'll talk about tomorrow, how I think that should work in a way that doesn't sort of lead to the sort of thing that we're seeing with the case of Texas, kind of the Supreme Court cases pushed back, where if you allow democratic governments too much influence over these things, then you can get some real problems on the other side. Or the banning of critical race theory in Florida schools, for example, is a similar phenomenon. So you want to kind of find the right balance between these things of maintaining sufficient sort of independence of the digital realm in order to prevent that kind of government overreach, while at the same time having democratic authorization. But I will be talking about that tomorrow in some depth. So hopefully you'll be here for that.
I'd like now to collect 2 or 3 questions before we wrap up for the evening. So let me see, hand here, one more here. Look for someone else.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. My name is Julian. I'm a postdoc at NYU, just passing through. But I'm curious about this question of who exercises the power in the context of algorithmic intermediaries that are in some sense in the commons, right? Like there's this move towards decentralization of, for example, social media, where maybe you have totally decentralized protocols that are totally open source and the user opts in, right? But that is an algorithmic intermediary. And so I wonder who is exercising the power.
Seth, get one more question.
Hi, my name is Glenn Fajardo. I teach at the Stanford D School. A lot of algorithmic intermediaries would describe themselves as just a neutral platform, right? There's like these claims to neutrality, that they're not exercising power. If you could wave a magic wand, how would you want them to describe the relationship to power?
Do I have one? Yeah, cool questions. Thank you. So look, I think that there is a sort of illusion in some of these decentralized models that we're getting rid of power. Like do away with intermediaries. That's kind of the mantra of crypto. And it's like, no, you're not doing away with intermediaries. You're just deciding now what the intermediary is going to be, and you're creating code that's going to play that role. I think that like it's a sort of controversial thought to assert that algorithmic systems themselves can exercise power. That's philosophically controversial. But I do think it's true, especially in these cases. When they're not under the effective control of any individual, and when they are able to kind of dynamically update and respond to the different circumstances that they face. So I think that in these cases, it is the intermediaries themselves that exercise power, that have power. And I think that we sort of, it's an interesting question whether it's different being governed by an algorithm versus being governed by a person. Like some people might say, well, the thing that is problematic about power is that some people have power over other people. So if it's an AI system that's governing you, then that's not there. That's definitely not the way that I go. But I think that that's the aspiration that underlies at least the sort of the crypto side of that. On the decentralization part, which obviously doesn't need to have the same measure of kind of governance as with crypto, where it's more like the Fediverse. I think that's a really interesting aspiration. I have this long discussion in the paper about sort of the role of exit in legitimating power. In a way, it's a kind of zombie argument that just won't die, despite all of the many scholars working on sort of technology and society who have argued that consent is not sufficient to justify or legitimate, whether it be data collection or whatever it might be. Like it just keeps coming back. But I think that there are interesting reasons why it does. Also, good arguments against relying on consent. One of them being just the sort of, decentralization, sort of giving lots of options, is in some ways a way of avoiding governance, and that can be a bad thing, right? And that's something I know that that Arvind has written about. Sort of that when you have a ton of collective action problems to deal with, you kind of want a centralized authority. That's the way we solve collective action problems generally. So yeah, really great question. Thank you. If I had a magic wand, certainly I wish that people would stop. They would stop. And if folks even do calling them neutral platforms, like there are interesting and important legal contexts here, and I'm not a legal scholar, especially not a US legal scholar. So there are aspects of that relating to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act that are kind of important in that context, which I don't pretend to sort of make judgment on. But certainly, since Tartan Gillespie's sort of work in the tens, his observation that platforms intervene, I think I'd probably want them to acknowledge that. And the reality is, you've got to acknowledge that, you've got to recognize that you're exercising power, and then you've got to figure out how to use it in ways that are justified. And that's a burden, but it's also, it's an opportunity for us collectively. And this goes back to some of the things that Marion was saying, where it is incredibly hard to change these social structures, and they will inevitably curtail our opportunities for things. But these are one of the very few tools we have that have some promise of making some sort of moving the needle at least a little bit. And I think that the opportunity to do that in a way that is democratically legitimate and that actually kind of draws on the shared values of society is one that should be kind of recognized and embraced, not sort of hands washed and say we're just a pipeline.
All right. We reassemble tomorrow at 5 p.m. in this room for the second and final lecture in the series and another discussion comment. And then once more on Thursday at 10 a.m. for a much longer and open discussion with 2 further discussants. For now, would you please join me in thanking Seth and Marion?
Really, really good.